The ocean below them was flat and blue and utterly indifferent. 15 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 droned northward at wavetop height, engines humming, their shadows flickering over the swells. Above, the sky over the Midway sector was clear and hard, the sun already brutal. Ensign George, Tex Gay, glanced left and right from his cockpit. 2 lines of Devastors, spread out just enough to avoid each other's wakes. Wings braced with wires, torpedoes slung underneath like fat, ugly fish. They looked like antiques even as they flew. Up ahead, the radio man gunner in his open rear cockpit tapped his shoulder and pointed. Smoke. Slim plumes on the horizon, then faint specks with bright flashes as the sun hit them. Ships. As they drew closer, the specks resolved into a formation that would pass into history. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, Hiryū, with their escorts, steaming in a tight diamond, wakes foaming. Around them, like a swarm of angry hornets, small black dots rose and wheeled. Fighters, zeros. Gay swallowed. No fighter escort, no dive bombers, no other friendly aircraft in sight. Just 15 slow, under-armored torpedo planes, flying straight and low toward the most powerful carrier force Japan had ever put to sea. He'd read the manuals. He knew the doctrine. Torpedo squadrons were supposed to attack in coordination. Fighters to keep enemy cap busy. Dive bombers to split their attention and force them down. Torpedo planes coming in under the chaos. Today, there was nothing else here. VT-8 was alone. Ahead, the Japanese fleet turned slightly, as though presenting its armored flank, and from the haze above, the first Zeros rolled down toward them. Gay tightened his grip on the control column. VT-8, we continue, came the voice of Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, their skipper, over the radio. We found them. We go straight in. 15 Devastators flew on. He already suspected he might not be flying back. He didn't yet know that in a few minutes, 14 of these 15 planes would be gone, and he would be floating alone in the middle of the enemy fleet, watching the battle change history. By June 1942, the TBD Devastator was obsolete. Introduced in the late 1930s, it had once been state-of-the-art, enclosed cockpit, internal bomb bay, torpedo carrying capability. But war had moved faster than the design. By Midway, its maximum speed was around 200 mph on a good day. It had poor armor and self-sealing tanks that weren't great. Its torpedoes, the Mark 13s, were notorious for running too deep or failing to detonate properly. Meanwhile, Japanese A6M-0 fighters were fast, maneuverable, and perfectly happy to tangle at low altitude, had excellent climb rates and long range, were flown by highly trained combat-experienced pilots. On paper, sending TBDs unsupported into a Japanese carrier task force was insanity. But the U.S. Navy didn't have much choice. In the wake of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, U.S. carrier strength was thin. The newer TBF Avenger torpedo bomber had just entered service but was not yet widely deployed. Most squadrons still flew Devastors. VT-8, based on USS Hornet, had done some workups with Avengers, but at Midway, the majority of the squadron was still using TBDs. Their CO, John Waldron, was not stupid. He knew his plane's limitations. He knew their torpedoes' problems. He also knew, if they didn't find and attack the Japanese carriers, Midway could be lost. If they held back waiting for the perfect coordinated strike, the enemy might get in the first decisive blow, as they had at Coral Sea. So when Hornet's air group launched for Midway, scouting confusion and communications failures meant groups diverged. Hornet's dive bombers, VB-8, VS-8, and fighters got misvectored, or never reached the Japanese. Waldron's VT-8 pressed on low, following his own instinct and reading of the charts. He bet his entire squadron on the belief that he'd chosen the right bearing for the enemy carriers. He was right. It cost him nearly everything. The launch from Hornet had been chaotic. Early June seas, carriers turning into the wind, crews scrambling to man their aircraft. On the flight deck, Waldron had briefed his men bluntly. "This is it, boys. We'll probably never be more than this close to the enemy again. We're going in, and we're going in a straight line. Any man who doesn't care to go can get out right now." No one stepped away. Once airborne, the air group had followed the initial planned vector, for a while. Over open ocean, with only clouds and compass headings, it was easy to get lost mentally, if not physically. At some point, conflicting orders and radio chatter from above tried to redirect them. Waldron disagreed. "We're going here," he insisted to his pilots, jabbing at his chart mid-air with gloved fingers. "Follow me." He broke off from the rest of Hornet's air group. VT-8 turned on a new heading. Gay and the other pilots had a choice: follow the rest of the group to where the doctrine said the enemy should be, or follow their skipper's gut. They stayed glued to Waldron's tail. Hours passed. Fuel dripped away from their limited tanks. Midway was behind them now, a memory somewhere over the horizon. Waldron's intuition was rewarded when a thin strip of smoke marred the skyline. Not from burning ships, from stacked gases, engine exhaust from a large formation steaming at high speed. "The Japanese carriers." Waldron's voice came over the radio. "There it is, boys, just as I told you." For that, he would be rightfully credited. For what happened next, he would be remembered for something else. Leading his men into what they all likely knew was a one-way mission. The textbook said torpedo squadrons should attack under cover. Friendly fighters keeping the enemy cap busy. Dive bombers punching down from above, forcing carriers to maneuver and split their flak. VT-8 had none of that. Overhead, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, Zeeks from the carriers, were already in the air. The carriers had been launching and recovering strike aircraft all morning. From their vantage at higher altitude, the Zero pilots saw 15 dots at low level, making straight for the heart of the formation. They must have felt a mix of surprise and contempt. Old, slow Devastors, lined up. No escorts. Perfect targets. Their leaders gave simple orders. Attack in turn. Do not let them reach torpedo range. The Zeros dove. From Gay's cockpit, the sky above erupted in flashing sun-off wings, white streaks of contrails, and then thin lines of tracer fire. The first Zeke swept down obliquely and tore into the formation, its 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons ripping canvas and metal. A TBD to Gay's left burst into flame and cartwheeled into the ocean. Another began to trail smoke. Waldron's voice crackled urgently. "We will go in. Just keep weaving and go in. We can still get some hits." He began to snake his formation slightly, trying to throw off the gunnery solution of attacking fighters while still holding a general course toward the carriers. It wasn't much. Zeros swooped in from all arcs, high 6, from the beam, from ahead. The Devastors' dorsal and tail guns barked in response, but the fields of fire were limited. At torpedo approach speed, low and slow, you were a sitting duck. To make matters worse, the Devastors' Mark 13 torpedoes required a relatively straight, level approach at low altitude and medium speed to avoid failure. That meant you had to fly right into the teeth of enemy fire, hardly jinking in the final seconds. Pilots who'd survived earlier action, he says, like Coral Sea, already distrusted their torpedoes. But hope is a stubborn thing. Gay pushed his throttle as far as he dared without over-revving, trying to keep under Waldron, trying to keep the carrier square in his windshield. Ahead, anti-aircraft guns on the escorts and carriers finally opened up, filling the low sky with black puffs and shell splashes. Between the flak and the fighters, VT-8 was flying into a literal wall of fire, What happened next has been described as courageous suicide and tactical necessity. It was probably both. One by one, the Devastors that hadn't yet been hit pressed into torpedo range. Waldron drove in toward Kaga. Radio transcripts and survivor accounts suggest he held his line under withering fire, likely released his torpedo, was then set ablaze or torn apart by multiple hits. His plane was seen to crash into the sea. No parachutes opened. Behind him, other planes tried to line up. Gay picked a target, a carrier turning broadside to comb potential torpedo tracks. Anti-aircraft fire shook his Devastator. Shrapnel tore through the fabric of his wings. His radio man gunner fired short, desperate bursts at passing Zeros. "Approach speed," Gay muttered, half to his aircraft, half to the unreliable torpedo slung below. He leveled off, lined up the lead carrier's bow. Zeros stitched tracers in front of him, behind him, across him. He pressed the release at what he judged was the correct distance. The torpedo plunged into the water, white wake foaming. He banked away, trying to open distance to make a turn and escape. Almost immediately, a Zero latched onto his tail. Cannon shells ripped through his cockpit. Glass shattered. Instruments exploded, throwing shards. The Devastator lurched, controls going sloppy. Flames licked at the fuselage. Gay realized he had choices. None good. Stay with the plane and ride it into the sea. Try to glide closer to the carriers and maybe crash into one, if he even had enough control left, or ditch and hope someone didn't shoot him in the water. He chose survival, and perhaps future usefulness, over a symbolic gesture. He ditched. The TBD hit the water hard. The impact threw him forward, jerking his harness so violently he almost blacked out. Water roared in through shattered panels. The plane began to sink almost immediately. He fought free of his wraps, scrambled out as the tail began to slide under. His gunner did not make it. Gasping in the surprisingly cold Pacific water, Gay clung to a seat cushion for buoyancy as the wreckage went under. Around him, debris floated. Fragments of other planes, bits of insulation, a life vest. He looked up. The air was full of circling Zeros and the orderly chaos of a Japanese carrier task force under attack. Not by him. By someone else. He realized, with dull shock, that he was now alone in the middle of the enemy fleet. And every other Devastator of VT-8 was gone. George Gay later said he took two main actions to avoid being killed outright. He slipped under his seat cushion, using it as partial cover and concealment. He tried to keep his face toward the sun as much as possible, to avoid reflections off his eyes giving him away. From his precarious vantage, drifting amid destroyer wakes and carrier shadows, he saw things no one else in the American fleet saw quite the same way. He watched. Japanese destroyers weaving back and forth, looking for torpedo wakes. Carriers beginning to recover aircraft from earlier strikes. Flight decks crowded with fueled, armed planes. He also saw no evidence that any of VT-8's torpedoes had detonated successfully. For all their sacrifice, they had scored no hits. From a purely tactical, immediate standpoint, their attack was a failure. From a broader operational view, it did something else. It pulled the Japanese cap down. Zeros, now at low altitude and low on fuel, had spent precious ammunition shredding Devastors instead of patrolling higher up. As Gay treaded water and tried not to be noticed by passing ships, something changed overhead. New aircraft arrived. From high altitude, almost out of the sun, American dive bombers finally appeared. SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown, having found the fleet by different routes. They rolled into their dives just as many Japanese decks were cluttered with aircraft and ordnance. Gay watched as bombs struck Kaga, turning her deck into a roaring inferno. Others hit Akagi and Sōryū, devastating hangars full of fuel and bombs. Secondary explosions ripped through ships that, minutes before, had seemed invulnerable. The carriers that had set up the trap for Midway now burned because they'd been caught mid-cycle, with decks full and Cappy distracted. VT-8 hadn't achieved hits, but their attack timing had contributed to that vulnerability. In cold operation, null terms, their doomed run helped set the table for the decisive blow. In human terms, it meant Gay floated in an ocean littered with the wreckage of his squadron, while the sky rained vengeance down that he would never personally claim. George Gay was eventually rescued by a US PBY flying boat after spending over 30 hours in the water. When he rejoined American forces and told his story, there was initial skepticism. One survivor. No hits. How much could he really have seen? Post-war analysis, matching his recollections with Japanese records, confirmed much of what he described. The official tally for VT-8 at Midway was grim 15. TBD Devastors launched from USS Hornet. All 15 shot down, 9 of 30 aircrew killed in action. Only Ensign Gay survived from the airborne detachment. A detachment of VT-8 Avengers flying from Midway itself also suffered heavy losses. Waldron and his men were awarded the Navy Cross, many posthumously. Their action has been cited in almost every major account of Midway since, not for hits scored, but for courage and timing. The cold, brutal reality. They flew outdated aircraft against a prepared, numerically superior enemy. Their torpedoes almost certainly failed mechanically even when launched. Their immediate impact on enemy hulls was nil. The deeper truth. Their willingness to press home a hopeless attack drew fighters down and forced Japanese carriers to maneuver and keep their decks busy with cap instead of reorganizing. Along with other torpedo attacks, from VT-3, VT-6, they bought the American dive bombers a clearer path to deliver the killing blows. The phrase, 15 Devastators, 1 survivor, is more than just a hook. It's a shorthand for obsolete hardware used beyond its time. Doctrinal ideals broken by reality. Individual crews deciding to go in anyway because the strategic situation demanded someone do it. If you have family who served in torpedo squadrons, whether in Devastors, Avengers, or later types, drop their stories in the comments. These were the guys flying low and slow into the worst possible place a pilot can be, straight toward an alerted fleet, with nowhere to hide. And if you want more micro-histories like this, small units in impossible situations that still manage to bend the course of a battle, hit subscribe. There are more names on Midway's roster than the big carriers and admirals. VT-8 deserves their share of the story.